Hi, my name is Natalie Jackson, and I'm a certified shadow work facilitator. I'll be speaking to you today to share some of our beliefs and the concepts we employ in facilitating shadow work. We always facilitate in pairs, so you'll hear me use we all the way through this presentation. We want you to have the basic idea of what shadow work is, the model on which it's based, before you'd seriously consider coming to a shadow work training. We also want the information on this presentation to be a preparation for you if you're already signed up and planning to come to Shadow Work Weekend. We like to have folks know about our model and know what some of our beliefs and ideas are about shadow work and personal growth, so that you can gauge and see whether what we believe works and fits for you before you show up at any of our workshops. There's a lot of information in here, and there's a lot more about shadow work if you want to know. Please feel free to call us if you have any questions, or if you're coming to a shadow work workshop, please bring all your questions along and we'll try to make sure we give you the answers from our great depths of wisdom on almost anything you can ask. So we want to start by talking about what we mean by shadow. What is a shadow? What are we talking about when we're talking about shadows? We like best Robert Bly's definition of shadow in his book A Little Book on Human Shadow, where Bly says that we're all born into what he calls a 360-degree personality, which means that we pretty much express who we are in all directions all the time without much censor. Our internal editors or censors haven't been developed yet, so anything that comes to us to express, we just express it without thinking twice. But as we grow up, our parents and teachers and our culture in general teach us that all 360 degrees of the pie we are expressing are not necessarily acceptable. And as Bly puts it, we soon develop this dynamic where it's like we're carrying a big bag over our shoulders. And our culture teaches us to take certain slices of that 360-degree pie, throw it in the bag, to repress it, to get it out of sight, so we won't be seen with it. So that often what happens to many of us as we get into our 30s and 40s is we're actually expressing a very small slice of the pie that we were born with, because we have most of the pie in this bag over our shoulder that we've been dragging around for many, many years. And that it's really starting to weigh us down, starting to slow us down, keep us from really doing and being what we really want to be and do in our lives. Oftentimes we start out by throwing in the bag things we would call bad things, our anger or our jealousy or our envy of someone else. We don't want to be seen with those things. Maybe parts of our sexuality or parts of us that we want to take revenge, We start by throwing the kind of icky things in the bag. But along with them, a lot of gold gets thrown into the bag too. Sometimes it's our belief in ourselves, or our sense of wholeness, or our sense of being blessed, our sense of having a great mission in our lives. Our loving connection of intimacy can get thrown in the bag too. Or a sense of creativity or playfulness. For so many of us, once we hit puberty, we thought, okay, I'm getting to be an adult now, I can't play anymore. So we put our playfulness or our childlike qualities in the bag. So it's not just icky, nasty, dark stuff that we repress and throw in the shadow bag. But a lot of us have also thrown a lot of golden qualities into our bags. In general, by shadow, we mean anything that's been repressed or denied or thrown into the bag, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. If we are trying to keep from being that part of ourselves, if we are trying to keep from showing that to ourselves or to others, then we'd say that that quality in us is in shadow. So now you know what a shadow is. So now you might be wondering, well, how can you know what's in shadow for you? And there are several ways that you can look for what qualities or energies you might have in your shadow bag. And one is that when you take a part of yourself and you throw it into your shoulder, over your shoulder into the bag, it doesn't actually make it into that bag. Sometimes you miss the bag. And so it ends up going all around the world, and that quality shows up in the person that you are talking with, where it really bugs you. I might have taken my righteous self and decided I hate people who are self-righteous. I'm not going to be self-righteous. That's not what I want to be. And I throw it over my shoulder and decide that self-righteous is not how I'm going to be. And then lo and behold, I wind up running into self-righteous people everywhere I go in my world. Maybe noticing them more than other people would notice them, because we're trying not to notice them in ourselves. This psychological phenomenon is called projection by most other people. So when we take parts of ourselves that we have difficulty owning or owning up to and paint them onto other people, or exaggerate them at least in other people. And that's one way of knowing something that might be your shadow. What sorts of things really bother you when you see them in other people, or really trigger you? We often talk about, what do I get triggered by when I see it in other people? Or I might see things that I really revere or admire in others, and those are actually golden shadows of mine. I might look at someone in my life that's really spontaneous and think, wow, I just can't believe she can be like that. I wish I could be more spontaneous like she is. Or I might look at someone who's really courageous and say, boy, I'd never do that. I just don't have the courage to do that kind of thing. Those are examples of ways where our golden shadow has gone around the world and shown up in someone else. So when I'm looking for what might be in shadow for me, one of the ways to do that is to look at the things that I really don't like in other people and the things I really love and admire in other people. Those things might be clues to what I might have in my shadow bag. In the AA 12-step tradition, they have a saying, if you spot it, you got it. And that means exactly what we're talking about here. The things that you most notice, good or bad, in other people are often the things that indicate your shadows. The things in you that you're having difficulty focusing on. And that doesn't mean that they don't have that quality. But it can be a clue for me to see what might be in my own shadow. Another way to know whether or not you might have something in shadow is to consider the idea that the bag that you're carrying over your shoulder might not be hermetically sealed. In other words, some of that stuff that we try not to be may be leaking out in our behavior in ways that we don't particularly appreciate, or maybe others don't appreciate either. So one way you can see what might be leaking is to look for behaviors that you find yourself doing by accident rather than consciously or in a kind of on purpose kind of way. For instance, it's a common phenomenon for people who believe that it's really not okay for them to be angry, for them to develop a kind of flash temper, which something will trigger them, and then all of a sudden their anger will come rushing out more or less by accident, like it was an accident. And people will look back and say, gee, that was an accident. I really didn't mean to do that. It just came out. That's an example of the bag leaking, and another indication of what might be in shadow. So one way you can look for energies or behaviors that might be leaking out of you is to look at behaviors that you find yourself doing that seem to be in control of you rather than you being in control of it. So if you want to look at some of the things that might be compulsive in your life, your bad habits, maybe emotions, or even patterns of thought that come over you when you distinctly have the sense that you are out of control, that something is running you, that is often another indication that that energy is in shadow for you. And it's not that there are other energies that come in and push us around, but there are parts of ourselves that we have not owned, that we have in shadow that can push us around because we won't acknowledge that they are a part of us. And it's a way that when I'm in denial about having a certain energy or a certain behavior as part of myself, then I'm not in control of that energy. And I can't see it when I'm doing it even. It just comes over me by accident in a way that's way beyond my control. So those are some of the ways that you might begin looking at yourself to see what you might have in shadow. Now that you've seen some more about shadows and what shadows are about, why might you want to do something like shadow work? We believe that inside of each shadow there's a legitimate, useful even golden energy that you can access if you're willing to get the coating off of it. There's a way that when these things get put in the bag, they get a little crusty, they get a little moldy, even a little smelly in there because they just haven't been used and handled much. And we think that shadow work is a way for you to have a space where you can explore some energy, where you don't have to explore it for real in your life, and sort of pick through it and find the wisdom in that piece of yourself. Find the motivation, the energy, the gold inside of that energy, and use it in your life. At the same time, it's not useful for you to just start doing that anywhere and everywhere in your life. We believe that you need what we call it a container, which we're going to talk about more in a minute. You need a container, a symbolic space away from your regular life where you can take things out of the bag and work with them, polish them up, so you find what part, the gold in the center, that you want to take back out into your day-to-day life. We've also found that doing shadow work, having a place to take these things out and work with them, can keep you from the experience of having something else controlling you, or that you're acting out by accident. We often say in shadow work that if you can do something, if you can act out an energy on purpose in a safe, ritual way, in a symbolic container, then you can learn to stop acting out that energy outside of that special shadow work space. So one of the purposes of doing shadow work is to learn to stop doing behaviors that are goofing up your life outside of a shadow work container. We believe that the process of putting things into the shadow bag, putting things in shadow, and then taking them out again and working with them to reintegrate them into ourselves, we believe that that is a useful process, and that working with my shadow is a way of empowering my life. I don't actually believe that I will ever be shadow free, but the process of putting things into the bag and then taking them out is a way of growing and becoming a fully mature adult human being. We can use all of our parts in sort of glorious harmony that feels super intense and alive and is a joyful way to live life. So that's what we wanted to tell you about the shadow. We've come to realize increasingly in our work in this area that just as important, whatever brilliance the facilitators may bring to the process, is what we call the container in which they're working. If you can sort of imagine drawing a circle around a group of people, we think that that is actually made up of beliefs that those people have agreed to share in that container. Sort of like drawing a circle around this place. The makeup of that circle is just as important as any action that's taken inside that circle. And that circle we call the container, by which we mean it is sort of a cauldron that holds the mix for this psychological process. And we believe that there cannot be safe shadow work without a safe container. So anytime we get together to do this work, whether it's with old hands, people who've done a lot of shadow work with us before, or brand new folks who've never worked with us, we take the time to set the container well before we jump into it, before we do a lot of personal process work. We think it's absolutely essential that you know what our beliefs are as facilitators, because we're holding a lot of that container, at least at first, and this makes it safer for you. Doesn't mean you need to agree with our beliefs. You just need to know what they are, so that you can more or less navigate in that space. So you won't unduly feel influenced or manipulated by the beliefs that we might hold. One way that we would define an unsafe container is a place in which facilitators, whether or not they mean to, are pushing participants into a certain kind of resolution or a certain kind of process because the facilitators are holding certain beliefs that the participants don't know about. We certainly have our agendas and our own personal beliefs about what a given participant in one of our workshops needs. And we do our best to make those agendas and beliefs explicit and upfront before someone gives themselves over to us, so that person can judge whether or not it's a fit. So one of the purposes of this presentation is for us to explain some of our beliefs to you, so you can make a judgment on whether shadow work fits for you. One of the first things we do in the shadow work container whenever we have a group of people together is that we begin by asking everyone to explain or answer this question. What do you want to have happen here? That's how we begin building the container, that circle around the group. By having everyone say in that space what they want to have happen, then as facilitators, we believe we can navigate with any given participant as to what they've said they want to have happen. It's a way we can hold ourselves accountable to not be putting our agenda onto somebody else. Inside of our shadow work container, we want things to be fully consensual. So if you choose to come to a shadow work weekend, you choose what to share, what to work on, and you choose what not to share. You can think about your shadow bag that you're carrying over your shoulder, and you think about all the shadows you have in there and imagine them as onions. And when you come to the workshop, you choose which onion, if any, you want to pull out of the bag and share with us and share with the rest of the group. And you choose as well if you are going to just pull away some of the brown papery skin on the outside, or if you're going to take out your cleaver and cut your onion all the way to the core, or something in between. We're really not interested in making you cleave your onion all the way to the core if that's not what's right for you. We love to watch and empower people to work at their own speed. We think that is the best kind of work that lasts. Now, there are people we know, and there are times in everyone's life that they want to go to a seminar and have someone hit them right between the eyes with a 2x4 and just give them a big wake-up call and knock them over backwards. And they don't want anyone to ask their permission either. And if that's your learning style at this point, then shadow work might not be a right fit for you. We like working very consensually with our participants so that they're cooperating with us in their own growth, because we think that that's the kind of growth that lasts. Shadow work isn't necessarily appropriate for anyone and everyone at any given time. And so you make that decision that's right for you. So we're talking here about the container that exists sort of in psychological space in which we work. And we want to say a word to you about how a graph of time might move through the shadow work weekend or the shadow work seminar. How we see personal growth working through time. What is our model for that? And what are our beliefs around that? And we'll begin by saying that we think it's a good thing that people begin by putting things in the bag and then taking them out later. There are cycles of growth in all of our lives, and that's perfectly appropriate. Sometimes we liken it to climbing a mountain. A cycle of growth of life is like climbing a mountain. There's an uphill side, usually where people are striving for some sort of ideal, and as they strive to climb the mountain, they're putting lots of stuff in the bag. They're not necessarily trying to be all of themselves. They're just trying to get somewhere, or maybe define themselves a little better. But they're putting off the excess baggage that is not serving them in the climb up the mountain. And then usually in the second half of a cycle of growth, people get to the top of the mountain. They get to some sort of realization, like aha moment. Then they want to bring that back down into their real life. And here's where shadow work really comes in the best. Because shadow work is a place where before you simply bring brand new realizations directly into life, and sometimes suffer the consequences of the fact that they don't always fit immediately. Shadow work is a place where you can bring out the parts of yourselves that you put in the bag earlier, and you work with them in a safe way, so you know how to handle them, and you can harness them. And then when you bring them back into your real life, they'll work a whole lot better. So a shadow work seminar is like a way station almost on the way back down the mountain. It's a place where you can stop off and do some work to reintegrate the parts of you that you left behind earlier in your current cycle of growth. A way that you can reintegrate them so you can use them to empower your life. Most of the people who come to shadow work seminars are in the second half of some kind of cycle of growth. We don't have a lot of very young people who come. And if they do, they're usually at the second half of some kind of cycle of growth. This is more for going downhill, we say, than it is for going uphill. So that's a little idea about what we believe, about how time moves through a shadow work container. So next we're going to talk to you about how we see the walls of this container. In our model, there are 4 walls. We'll talk about 4 different kinds of energies that we think hold a circle in which all of human experience happens. We like best the names devised for these 4 energies by Dr. Robert Moore and Doug Gillette, who wrote a book called King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, in which they distilled Carl Jung's archetypal psychology down into 4 descriptions of these 4 basic archetypes as they were seen in the male psyche. Now, we've done a lot of work with this with Moore and Gillette's archetypes, and I'd say adapted them for our use. And we've also found that their descriptions, with some additions, work really well for women as well. So we've broadened them out to those archetypes as they live in men and women. So if you like, you could envision a pyramid with 4 sides on it. This is an image that Robert Moore and Doug Gillette use in their book quite a bit. And you can imagine that each one of the faces of the pyramid describes one energy that we're going to talk about in the next presentation. Now, Cliff Barry, the creator of shadow work, actually ran across Moore and Gillette's book first. And when he did that, he did the brilliant thing that he always does, in that he started to see connections with this system of the 4 archetypes and other systems of 4 from all different cultures around the world. For instance, if you look at the 4 elements as they're described in astrology, or the 4 family roles that people are said to grow up in, or the 4 most basic emotions that people feel, or almost anything else that comes in 4s, you can see that Moore and Gillette have discovered a very basic truth that's been around for a really long time. So we've got this system of using different models to describe each of these 4 different energies. And what we want to do is go around our pyramid of 4 and describe to you what we see in each of the quarters. So there will be 4 parts to follow this. And for each wall of the pyramid, we'll talk about each of that archetype that Robert Moore and Gillette have described. Either king, and for this purpose we call it sovereign as a gender-neutral term. So sovereign, warrior, magician, or lover. And we'll talk about how there's a masculine side or a feminine side to that energy. And we'll describe the element there, either earth, fire, air, or water. We'll look at Sharon Wegschitter's work about the 4 family roles that people grow up in, and talk about which one of those fits on that side. And we'll also talk about which of the basic human emotions acts as a gateway to that side of the pyramid. We'll talk about all of those different elements as a way of describing the sort of healthy, well-rounded energy in each quarter that any adult can access. Although most of us don't access every quarter in that sort of healthy, well-rounded kind of way at all times, and the reason for that is because we have shadows. And then next, after we try and sort of describe how these energies show up in the quote-unquote healthy way, we'll talk about what it looks like when this side of the pyramid goes into shadow, when you take this sort of energy and you put it in your bag of shadows. For instance, one way to describe these energies is to say that there are some very old and basic animal instincts in each of us. And one of these instincts lives on each of these walls. And in our process of becoming cultured and civilized people, we all decided at some point that we're going to try to not be so much like animals. So we put some of our animal instincts in shadow. So we'll talk to you about how some of these ancient energies, some of these ancient instincts even, show up to us as shadows, often on each side of these 4 quarters. We'll also talk a little bit about the way we usually decide to repress a part of ourselves, to put a part of ourselves in shadow, is because we receive some kind of psychological or emotional or spiritual wound when we're growing up, either from our families or our culture or whoever's influenced us. But we get wounded in such a way that makes us decide that we need to repress a part of ourselves, and then out of that grows a shadow. So we'll also talk about the really deep wound that we see in each quarter. Usually that wound comes from us accepting some sort of shaming message. We end up with some kind of voice in our head that says something to us all the time that is sort of shaming, and that will start this whole shadow process. So when we're looking at shadows, usually what will happen is that the energy in a given quarter shows up as having too much. I look like I have too much of this energy, or I look like I have too little of this. So if I have a shadow in my magician quarter, for example, I'll look like I have too much magician energy, or I'll look like I don't have any magician energy at all. Now we found in shadow work that it is more useful in our minds to work with participants on bringing up what they seem to have too little of, rather than try to lessen what someone seems to have too much of. In our book, trying to lessen what you have too much of is a way that things go into shadow in the first place. So we found it much more useful. Usually if someone looks like they have too much of one energy, we can always find another one of the four that they have too little of. And where the work is to bring up the energy that they have too little of. We actually don't believe that you can have too much of any given energy. You can't possibly have too much magician energy. What can happen is that you can have too much for the current balance of all four energies. So it's out of balance. But we don't believe that you ever have too much. This work is basically about learning how to balance yourself. In some ways about learning how to carry a container around with you that's balanced, so you can really be yourself in the middle of that container. And in each of the four directions, we'll also describe a tool that we use in bringing that energy out of shadow. There's a great tool in each of the four directions that can be used to rectify that energy when it's been shadowed. So as we go through the presentation and talk about the four directions, we'll be talking about what we believe is in each of these four quarters. And we want you to remember that these are our beliefs, and we're working to make our shadow work container safe by sharing these beliefs with you. Be aware as we go that different cultures actually line up energies in different ways, and none of this is actually set in stone. This is just our snapshot of these four energies. So here on this page you see a map that lays out the four-quarter model for this work. And keep in mind also that while these four archetypal energies are easy to separate in thought, in life they're not so easy to separate. When we really get down to doing something, oftentimes all these energies combine to create real life. And you'll notice that even as we talk about them and as we think about them, there's a lot of overlap between the quarters. So don't worry if it's not exactly cut and dry. If you find something of yours that you think fits in one quarter rather than what we're saying it is in that quarter, don't worry about it. This is an art, not a science. A rough description of four energies in four directions. Most people, when we start talking about this, start comparing what we're saying to themselves. So I'm imagining that you'll start looking for your own shadows in there. And that's a very useful thing to do. And you may gain some real insight from that. At the same time, be aware of the abnormal psychology 101 problem, where you start thinking you have every problem in the world. There is no need, as you listen to this presentation, for you to take all of this on. See what fits for you, but don't take everything on. We don't think it's necessarily useful to try and figure out what is your shadow as a whole person. That can be a real tough thing to figure out and doesn't particularly help you when you do figure it out. We prefer to look at what is your shadow relative to a certain situation, relative to something you want, maybe relative to a problem you're having, or to a dream that you have for your future. What is your shadow relative to that? What maybe is holding you back from achieving that? We think it makes it much easier and less shaming to look at the shadows you may have if you're looking at them in relation to something you want to accomplish. Because in different places in their lives, people have different shadows. We caution you against getting a little hung up on, oh, I always have warrior every time I turn around. So this completes the Shadow Work Basics presentation. The 4 quarters model is described in detail in a totally different presentation. And I really hope that you enjoy the exploration into the world of shadows.